Perfect. Excellent. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today at this webinar, COP30-ready in 30 minutes, your food systems data briefing. Really nice to see we've got quite a big audience and people are still joining. But we're going to get going and start cracking because we have a lot to cover today. So my name is Stephanie Moore. I'm Senior UN Policy and Advocacy Manager at ProVeg International. And I hope to see many of you also at COP30, as I will be part of ProVeg International's delegation in Belém. And so today's webinar is going to be for you a crash course to help you get up to speed on food systems data so that you can head into the climate discussions with all of that information at your fingertips. So if we could start the presentation, please. And we will have today two parts to this webinar. So in the first, I will be handing over to my colleague, Daniel Brauner, who will give you the key facts and the trends that are shaping the food systems agenda ahead of COP30. And he'll also be sharing with you the most relevant and reliable data that connects food production and consumption to the climate outcomes. And that should take around 15 minutes. Then we'll move to the second part, which will be to look at how this science and evidence translates into policy actions at COP30 and beyond, which will take about 5 minutes. And then at the end, hopefully we'll have another 5 minutes or so left for a Q&A, so for you to ask questions. On that, just some quick housekeeping rules. You will be muted. However, please do put your questions into the Q&A box that you can see at the bottom of your screen. And as I said, we'll come to those at the end. And then also to let you know, as you can hear, there is a recording of this webinar happening, and that recording will be shared with all participants after the event. So without further ado, a quick introduction from me to our main speaker today, Daniel Brauner. So Daniel is the Food Systems Sustainability Lead at ProVeg International, and he has over a decade of experience at the intersection of research, sustainability, and food systems. At ProVeg International, he is responsible for sustainability topics, data preparation, and also for the food systems data platform. And that platform is there to help users access evidence-based information to support informed decision-making when it comes to global food systems. Daniel in his work focuses on translating data and scientific findings into actionable insights for policy and practice. And he does that with the goal of supporting a shift towards healthier and more sustainable diets. Daniel is passionate about using data to make complex systems more transparent, measurable, and also aligned with sustainability goals. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Steph. And it's really great to have the opportunity today to speak to so many attendees that are already in this webinar. And maybe like many of you, I started my day today with breakfast and a quick look at the news. One headline that caught my eye was, for example, that the Paris Agreement is now nearly 10 years old. At the same time, I saw that climate pledges, even if fully implemented, would now currently lead us to a 2.8 degree of global warming. So we are not there yet where we should be. And while I was eating, that really stuck for me with a moment. And after all, my breakfast more or less was also giving me the energy to start my day, but it's also part of a much bigger picture. So what I had was a bowl of cereals and some fruit, which was maybe up to 200 grams. Now, I'm not the only one. I'm living in Germany, so we have more than 83 million people that are eating their breakfast in Germany every day. Next slide, please. Which, if everyone would eat the same, adds up to 16,000 tons of food just for breakfast. And globally, if we have a look at the next slide, we have about 8 billion people that in one way or the other do the same, adding up to even more food. So in total, altogether, humanity, if we have a look at the next slide, produces around 6 billion tons of food every year. just to meet our basic needs, to let us function the way we do. And this number is unimaginably high. I try to somehow put it into perspective, but it remains abstract. For example, if we think of it in terms of the Eiffel Tower, this would add up to the weight of 549,000 Eiffel Towers, which is equivalent to half the way to the moon if we stack them in the end. So all of this food has to come from somewhere. As you see, it needs to be grown, it needs to be processed and transported on a massive scale. And it's probably something we often forget when we are standing in grocery stores and so on. So if we take a closer look, about 70% of land is habitable. Half of this habitable land is used for agriculture. The major part of this is used to grow animal feed, while only a smaller part goes into crops for direct human consumption, even though this part makes up the majority of the protein we eat, the majority of calories we eat. If we have a look at the next slide, historically, agriculture has come at a huge cost also for natural ecosystems, because vast areas of land have been cleared for farms, for pastures. Between 2000 and 2018, agriculture alone drove almost 9% of global deforestation. In some regions, such as South America, livestock alone, for example, livestock grazing, even accounts for the majority of that forest loss. And even if we have a look at the cropland expansion section on the left, we see, even though it's for cropland, vast amounts of those crops that we are planting there is in the end also used to feed animals, which can be which might be not the most effective in the long run. If we have a look at the next slide, the consequences go far beyond forests, because we are really going into ecosystems. It affects biodiversity, it affects water use. We see that if we have a look at the search results of the IUCN Red List, that agriculture is listed as a threat to about half of the species at risk of extinction. At the same time, if we have a look at the biomass of animals, of mammals on Earth, most of this is now from farmed animals and from humans, while 70% of the Earth's available freshwater is used for agriculture. And as I mentioned earlier, everything we eat needs to be grown, needs to be processed, to a certain degree transported and consumed. And all of that, of course, adds up. And it adds up to a huge climate footprint, as you can see, which means that the global food system is responsible for about a third of global greenhouse gas emissions. And if we have a look at the next slide, we see that global food system emissions over time did also increase. So we are not currently seeing a decrease. And if we go even deeper into detail, animal-based foods are responsible for about 20% of total human-made greenhouse gas emissions, even though there is a range. And also some quite important greenhouse gases we need to keep in mind when we think about that. If we have a look at the next slide, the impacts are massive, as you can see. And the 2020 study found that even if we leave the food system unaddressed, even if we reduce, for example, all emissions from fossil fuels, it will be nearly impossible to tackle our climate goals. I mean, 1.5 degrees, we need to see about that. And then even the 2-scenario goal already is at risk, only if we look at food already. If we have a look at the next slide, that's something you might also have already seen. The Eat Lancet Commission has updated their recommendations slightly. It's still more or less the same recommendations regarding the planetary health diet, because the evidence is quite strong for this kind of recommendations. And what we also have been able to see, this was part of the assessment, but also of a recently published paper, I think just this week, on the planetary boundaries, that food systems are also responsible for transgressing the majority of the planetary boundaries. Just if we think about greenhouse gas emissions, for example, we know that 17 gigatons are emitted from food systems. If we want to be within planetary boundaries, we would need to reduce this to 5 gigatons, so to about 1/3 of what is currently emitted, which is a huge reduction that is needed. And then if we look at the solution, there are a couple of levels we can have a look into. We can have a look at the product level. And if we look at the data, the solution often is clear and seems to be easy, even though when it comes to policy, it might be a bit more complicated in the end. But in most cases, plant-based foods emit far less than animal-based foods. That's true whether we compare different types of meats with plants, or even when we look into plant-based alternatives, which can have up to 90% lower environmental impacts, depending on what we compare it to. Also, when we look into milk. If we go to the next slide, if we combine different foods into meals, the difference is also striking. For example, if we have a look at a beef lasagna, its emissions are, again, quite high. And if we replace a couple of ingredients, we can really reduce the impact of those meals. There was one analysis of 311 recipes from Germany, from German cookbooks, that also compared all of those recipes. And you can see that not only emissions can be much lower, but also in some cases the price of those meals. And if we go to the next level and the next slide and talk about individual diets, this pattern is also clear. Studies show how different dietary patterns can affect emissions, and there is a multitude of studies. Now, this is just 2 of them. I think on food system data, you can find 20 or 30 different studies. This one is the most recent one from Scarborough et al., where you can see that diets that are high in meat and animal-based products do emit at least double as much as fully plant-based diets, which also holds true for a lot of other studies that assessed the same thing. And if we have a look at the next level, which is more the systemic level, we also see, for example, this overview, which is adopted from the IPCC 2019 report on land use, I think, that also shows impact reduction potentials of different diet on a more systemic level, where we see that the biggest effects are with moving towards more plant-rich diets. Another number, next please, from 2022, an assessment found that if high-income countries shifted to the planetary health diet or the Eat Lancet recommendations, agricultural emissions could drop by 61% in total, while freeing up an area of land roughly the size of Europe. And that's still not all. If that land was rewilded, for example, it could absorb in the end carbon from the atmosphere, creating a carbon sink that helps to offset emissions from sectors that are harder to decarbonize in the end. So if you have a look at this study, and there are more, you see that even if everyone adopted fully plant-based diets by 2050, we could sequester the equivalent of about 15 years worth of fossil fuel emissions, which is quite a lot. Finally, even though food systems have massive impacts, only a small fraction of public climate finance between 2021 and 2022 was directed towards transforming food systems. You might have seen this. It's only 2.5%. And 1.5% of this climate finance went to projects that explicitly mention sustainable food system practices. This is during the period 2021 to 2022. I haven't found more recent numbers, but I think there might be some. I just saw a new study just recently. However, especially this is also a huge opportunity. Food systems are both a major contributor to environmental pressures. They are also one of the most powerful levers for positive change. And what I also forget to say, they are one of the biggest environmental pressures, but they also do suffer from those environmental pressures. If we think and talk, for example, about yields, if we think about food security, if we think about water availability in the future, those are all topics we need to be aware of also in the future. So the choices we make as individuals, as communities, and as policymakers can really reshape how we grow food, how we share it, how we consume food. And yeah, by aligning our diets with the planet's limits and with the planetary boundaries, we are not just reducing emissions, we are also helping to improve health, to restore nature, building resilience for future generations, and also, of course, for our food system, which should be intertwined either way. So yeah, I think the next time I and anyone else in this room sit down for breakfast, it might be important to not just think about it as a meal, but also as a small daily chance to do something much bigger, but also on a policy level that there needs to be much done to tackle those large systemic challenges we have to work on. And I think this was it, Steph.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Daniel, for sharing all of that. That was a lot of information, a lot of figures and stats. So yes, just repeating again that the recording will be shared so people have time to digest everything, and pun not intended there. But also thanks for the reminder on 2 points, or maybe three actually. The last point about breakfast, our daily meals being an opportunity for us as consumers of food to make a difference. Then reminding us that 1.5 and also 2 degrees limits to global warming will not be within our reach if we don't take action on food systems. And then finally, the point I think you made near the end around food systems being both contributors but also victims of these challenges. So that makes this such an interesting topic, such a complicated topic. And with that, let's move on to actually think about how the science and the data translates into policy actions. So I want to give a very brief overview to just put on people's radar here where we might see food systems featuring at COP30 in Brazil. And I've just put out a few of the agenda items. There may be more, but I think these are ones that you should definitely have on your radar. And to start with, there is the Sharm el-Sheikh joint work on implementation of climate action on agriculture and food security. This is the official UNFCCC agenda item on agriculture, and we will be seeing negotiations at COP30 happening there. There is, I want to flag here, an online portal where parties, but also non-parties, can make submissions. And on our behalf, ProVeg, we've put in 2 submissions. One is on the catering guide, and one is on the school plates that we've produced. These are reports that give policy recommendations on how countries can, use dietary shifts to support a food systems transition. Another very important item, which would be very much top of people's minds, would be the global goal on adaptation. Here, we've already seen a list of indicators to support countries in measuring how well they're doing on the adaptation side of things when it comes to climate change. That list is on the table, and there are several food systems indicators, which reflect the full food and agriculture value chain, which is great. But these indicators need to be further refined and also agreed. So please, yeah, keep an eye on that. Then there's the Just Transition Work Program, which I wanted to flag. So this is a way to promote pathways that ensure the Paris Agreement goals are achieved in a way that is just and also equitable. There will be negotiations at COP going on this, and a lot of civil society actors have been calling for the work program to be broadened to also include food systems considerations in it. Then, one item that is not on the formal agenda, but is a COP30 presidency initiative, is the Climate Action Agenda. So here the idea is that it's meant to accelerate the implementation of countries' commitments to the Paris Agreement in the global stocktake. So looking at the outcomes of the global stocktake and really align efforts from all actors, both governments, but also non-state actors, businesses, civil society, and others, to make sure that we can stay within the boundaries. And there's one axis on agriculture in particular. It's the one on transforming agriculture and food systems. So we'll be very curious to see what the presidency announces there at COP. And then finally, one, since Daniel also mentioned, we need to think about food systems, not just in terms of, carbon, but also other emissions. There's the Global Methane Pledge. So this is a commitment by countries that is outside of the UNFCCC, but will kind of be accompanying the conversations to reduce methane emissions by 30% below the 2020 levels by 2030. And we will be seeing in Belém a ministerial gathering, so a very high-level gathering, where countries will be reviewing their progress and also committing to new actions to reduce emissions. And food systems and livestock in particular are one of the key contributors to methane emissions. So all in all, addressing the impact of food systems in a holistic way through a holistic transformation, and that needs to include plant-rich diets, will be absolutely critical to achieve the climate, health, and equity goals that we need to see at COP30. Next slide, please. And then briefly, I want to just mention a way of putting food systems into policy action. That's been something that's been pushed by ProVeg and other civil society actors, which is the Belém Declaration on Plant-Rich Diets. That's a call on national governments to promote plant-rich diets by drafting and implementing national action plans for plant-based food in order to support that transition towards sustainable food systems. Next slide, please. There are three main goals to this declaration. One is to raise awareness, mobilizing governments to put these action plans into place. And those are inspired already by some really incredible work that's happening at the local level. Then to create global momentum. So far, over 120 signatories have endorsed the declaration. So there's a real kind of bottom-up pressure to make sure that we can grow global momentum. And the goal would be, to ensure that there's a discussion on national action plans for plant-based foods happening at COP32. And finally, also a commitment to take action. So we really need to, if we want to see meaningful change, we also need to see financial support being made available under these action plans, for instance, in the agri-food promotion budgets. Next slide, please. So why is it important to support the initiative? Governments around the world will not, as we said, be able to reach their climate goals if they don't address the current status of food systems. And so really this kind of global momentum we're seeing around food systems and also from the declaration makes us hopeful that getting local and national governments to focus on plant-based strategies as a key component is possible, so we can harvest the solutions to the climate crisis, health, economic, and also the food security challenges. So here, a quick overview of all of the signatories we've had so far. We're really pleased that we already have one city that's endorsed. That's the city of West Hollywood in California. We've got 15 public officials, from councillors of local councils to representatives of the European Parliament who've endorsed it, as well as over 100 NGOs. So next slide. Here you can find out more information about the Belém Declaration, and I will be shortly putting the link to our webpage into the chat, but if not, just search for Belém Declaration ProVeg and you'll find it very easily. And so next slide. here you can see how you can also endorse the declaration. You can scan the QR code. It takes you to a very simple form to fill out. And yeah, you can be part of building that really important momentum. So I will stop there and ask for the next slide. To just let you know, finally, a quick overview. We launched the Belém Declaration in Bonn this year at the June UNFCCC climate sessions. We were doing a formal presentation at COP30 in Brazil, but we will continue after that too. We will continue to gather endorsements throughout the next year up to COP31 in Australia. And then also be progressing, looking at progress that we can report at COP32, which will be in 2027. We don't quite know where, maybe Nigeria, maybe Ethiopia, we will see. And that's it on some policy actions. And now I'd love to take a look at some questions that we've had from the audience in the last few minutes. And I saw one that came through, Dania, for you in relation to the data that you were presenting. So the person asked, do the figures on food systems and food production include data from aquatic food systems, such as aquaculture and fishing vessels, or do they refer only to land-based livestock production? Thanks.
I think I already answered this by writing. And I think it depends on what we look at. If we look at Point Nemetschek data, for example, it also captures seafood, for example. Then there is this big database from Edgar Food, which is, I think, also used by the IPCC, which I guess also takes into account emissions, those emissions. However, I'm actually not really sure at the moment. I would need to have another look into that. However, if we look at Edgar Food, for example, they cover the whole supply chain, including also transport, energy, fuel use, and so on.
Thank you, Daniel. Um, then maybe another question, I think that's a very important one that somebody's raised, is talking, well, we're talking here about global food systems. And of course, geographically, areas are very different. The food that can be grown, that's available in countries can differ. So I saw somebody asked, and I think you're answering the question, Daniel, in the chat, but maybe you'd like to answer it live. So the person asked, in Arctic areas, there's far less access to vegetarian foods and perhaps a greater health need for animal protein. Hunting and fishing are also very significant in indigenous cultures. How would you apply your thinking to those issues? Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point, actually. And I think when I talk about those topics and when we talk about shifting toward more sustainable diets, it's usually referred to high income and industrialized food systems where we really have an overconsumption of animal-based products, and where we really also have large-scale livestock farming, which are major environmental drivers. I mean, if we think about Europe, for example, we are not only using the land in Europe, we are also importing large amounts of feed from Brazil, for example. I would say that in indigenous contexts, the situations is different. And yeah, sometimes foods can be more limited. So yeah, that's what I would say. We really also have to take into account the regional context, and the context of scale more or less. And I think here the main group that needs to be tackled is the more industrialized food systems.
Thanks. And I think that links perhaps to one final question as we're running out of time. But somebody pointed out that the term veganism can generate rejection from many decision makers, particularly in Brazil, and asked kind of what strategy we would suggest to discuss this issue during COP. So I don't know if you want to perhaps combine that with your answer just now.
Yeah, I think that's also complicated. I mainly use this term when it's mentioned also in studies. However, I also try to avoid it and like more to talk about plant-rich diets, for example, which include vegan diets, which include vegetarian diets, which include flexitarian diets, or the Eat Lancet recommendations, which all have or can have a big impact on reduction. So it's not about veganism as such. It really is more about moving in the right direction, reducing consumption of animal-based foods. And as we have seen, like the Eat Lancet recommendations also still include animal-based foods that are in line with planetary health, with the planet, with the planetary boundaries. So I think it really is about using the wording. Stephanie, maybe you also have some points on that.
Yes, just to wrap up as we are running out of time now, I would fully agree with you. I think it's important to remember in food systems that, yeah, it's not a one size fits all approach that we can take. You have to recognize different cultural, culinary contexts, also different geographic contexts. But while food systems are perhaps not the silver bullet and we need action on all fronts, I think it's really clear from what we've seen today that if we continue to ignore the huge potential that there is in a serious transition of food systems at a global level, we are really missing a trick in the textbook. And I think, yeah, we are at a stage where we really want to be sure to unlock the full potential that food systems offer as one of many solutions to tackling climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental pollution, but also people's health, as you pointed out, Daniel. So I think we will have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. If you want to continue the conversation, here you've got our emails. And yeah, please do reach out if you've got any follow-up questions. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.